Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome you this morning to this conversation about how the state of Sao Paulo has managed to innovate very rapidly and to continuously improve to sustain educational opportunity in the middle of one of the worst pandemics in the last century, global pandemics in the last century. Let me do a little housekeeping, sharing with you some information that can help you function. So we are discussing the case of Sao Paulo. Can you all see my screen right now? Can someone let me know if that's the case?
Yes.
Right, good. So this is part of a webinar series organized by the OECD in partnership with the World Bank Group, with 100, and with the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard to discuss how various education systems, jurisdictions, and organizations are sustaining education. And on the link that you see on that slide, you can access a recording of this webinar. There is an English interpretation. Secretary Rossieli is going to speak in Portuguese, and when he does, he will be translated into English. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says interpretation. Just select English when that happens. We do not have interpretation to Portuguese, however. You can use the question and answer function to post your questions, and that's at the bottom of the screen. And we will have the recording of this seminar at this link that you see on your screen right now. And on the link at the bottom, you can see, I think, about 25 case studies of educational continuity. And I want to acknowledge my good colleague, Stefan Vincent Lacrin, at the OECD for his phenomenal leadership in getting that series going. This is the case study we're discussing today. Case study authored by Lucia Dellagnello, who I will introduce in a moment. And on this link, you can actually see the case study. I will be later posting the link to that PDF on site. And our conversation today, we have four phenomenal speakers. First of all, Secretary Rossieli Soares Silva, who I have the great privilege of counting as my former student because he's one of the very first graduates of the program in education leadership developed by the Universidad de Juiz de Fora in partnership with the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And I think he's an exemplar of what the investment in leadership can produce for a country. And next to him, we have Lucia Dellagnello, another terrific former student, graduate of our university, and the president for the Center of Educational Innovation and the author of this case. We also have Patricia Vázquez, former Secretary of Education of the state of Puebla, and also one of the leaders, one of the governors of the National Institute of Educational Evaluation. And then we're joined by my dear colleague and the director of Director of Education and Skills, Andreas Schleicher. And the way this is going to run is I'm going to make a few opening remarks. Then we're going to turn it over to Secretary Rossieli. Then we will ask Lucia to give us some insights on her take on the case. We're then going to ask Patricia to reflect on what she sees on that experience from her unique vantage point as someone who's been a secretary and in very senior leadership roles in Mexico. And then we're going to turn it over to Andreas, who has a global overview on how various jurisdictions and systems are handling this pandemic for his reflections. And then we'll have a bit of an exchange within the panel and we'll address your questions. But let me begin taking us back to 1946. When this image was beamed back to Earth from space. To put us in context, this is a year after World War II had ended, another global calamity that had taken the lives of many. And I believe it was the beaming of that image that made many people on this planet aware that we were all in this together, that we're either going to make it together or sink together. And a year after that image was beamed, the United Nations basically drafted one of the most significant ideas, the idea that to produce a world in which we could have peace and stability, we had to guarantee every person a basic right. And one of those rights, the right to education, changed the face of humanity for the better, because that year, only 45% of the world population attended school, at a time when there were 2.5 billion humans on this planet. And 75 years later, with 7.5 billion humans on this planet, 95% of the world's population has attended school. It's a reminder that good things can happen in very difficult times when we have the capacity to seize the moment, to seize the opportunity, and to use the challenges to actually not just rebuild the world as it existed before the calamity, but better. And so our hope is that this series can help us remember that powerful idea, that we're all in this together. And our moment, our totality moment is this pandemic, of which we're still in the middle. We begin to see the end, but it's at least a few months away. And when the OECD, the World Bank, 100, and the Global Education Initiative decided to partner together, we did it in the spirit of lighting some candles in what could otherwise be a very dark night, helping to spotlight people who, against the odds and in spite of very challenging conditions, were doing the very best that was possible to sustain education. I think it's great news that today, one of the top concerns around the world is how to make sure that kids continue learning. Because in the last pandemic of this scale, 1918, education was not one of the top 3, wasn't even one of the top 10 priorities. And today, along with public health, along with reopening the economy, the concern for education is very much a concern of society. So with this collaborative effort, what we have tried to do is to offer a small contribution that can inspire, that can animate, that can create a new accountability to sustain educational opportunity. When we look at the inspiring efforts of leaders like Secretary Rossieli, it's a little harder to hide under the table and basically shut down schools and wait for someone else to solve the problem. Everybody is basically on the spot in the face of people who are doing things. And what we've tried to do with these case studies is to document the details, not only of what they did, but how they did it, in hope that this can animate the same kind of learning from comparative experience, the same kind of collaboration, the same kind of energy and creativity that was animated by the inclusion of the right of education in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and which produce the remarkable changes that I have described. Our hope is that we can, with these cases, make a small contribution to creating a Medici effect. Named in that way because at the end of the Italian pandemic, the Medicis invested in sciences and in the arts in that small city of Florence, producing a renaissance. So our hope is to contribute to that. I will conclude my remarks highlighting 5 themes, which I think are very salient in this case. The first one is the importance of making education a societal concern. Brazil over the last 2 decades, the biggest innovation in my view happening in Brazil over the last 2 decades. And let me put it in context. Brazil was 2 decades ago the country with the greatest educational, social inequalities. Education was really rock bottom in so many ways. And 2 decades ago, a number of organizations of civil society decided that they were going to be serious about education. And São Paulo led in the creation of a coalition of interests who said, let's collaborate for education. A consequence of that was that there were deliberate efforts to invest in leadership. It was a recognition that education shouldn't be a business for amateurs, but that one should identify and cultivate leadership. And that's why the program from which Secretary Rossieli graduated was created with great success. It's an example of agile government, of how governments can, in a situation like that, listen carefully, act decisively, do something, learn from it, and improve. And I know that Secretary Rossieli is in the very middle at the moment of generating a version 3.0 of the case that we're discussing to you. It's a beautiful example of how good leadership is about communication. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Not as in speaking, but as in listening. Secretary Rossieli, who's a survivor of COVID, he spent 16 days in the hospital. Each of those days was on Twitter, communicating with his very large number of followers. And that's a remarkable example of how modern technologies can be used to keep momentum, to keep a conversation about education going. It is also an example of how it is possible in this day and age to do remarkable things in a very short period of time. The state of Sao Paulo created in a matter of weeks an entire media center that created an alternative delivery system to deliver education. And I think this is analogous to what SpaceX is to the space program. It used to take governments decades to build rockets, and the enterprise was so resource intensive and time consuming that only governments could do that. That is no longer the case. And I think that Secretary Rossieli has exemplified how we can apply the very same principles to produce rapid prototyping, rapid innovation, rapid improvement in education. And lastly, it's obviously an example of how much can be achieved together when leadership is inviting, when leadership opens up the opportunities for all members of civil society to come together and collaborate. So with that, let me turn it over to Secretary Rossieli, and he's going to speak in Portuguese, so make sure interpretation says English for the rest of you, and take us back to the moment, Rossieli, when it became clear to you, Sao Paulo was one of the very first states to basically put in place an alternative program. What was in your mind? What was your hypothesis? What was your theory about what you had to do? And how has that evolved over time? Over to you.
Thank you, Professor. I have been looking to improve my English, but I still need to move forward. And so I'm going to speak in Portuguese.
Your English is muito bacana, so if you want to continue in English, please do it. It's amazing.
No, no, because I need to facilitate my reasoning, because my English is terrible. Sorry. Bom, vamos lá.
Well, let's start. When São Paulo, well, first of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here with you today. When on the 13th of March, São Paulo declared that we had community transmission in the state of São Paulo, we immediately suspended classes in the whole of the state of São Paulo. We're talking about 13.5 million students in, 3.5 million students in the state network, but actually a much larger number of people affected, because we also have to consider the municipal networks. But at the time, we also agreed that students should still be able to go to school if their parents had no one to look after them, because that was a main concern for us. But at the same time, how could we communicate and how could we work? We have to keep that in mind, you know, that role that we have of supporting students, supporting their families, etc. So during that first week, there was this option of still going to school if there was no one to look after the children at home. And then during that week, we worked together with our teachers, with our staff, and asked their opinion about what they thought might be the solution for the problem at the time. And there was, of course, a lot of resistance at the time, because lots of people did not feel comfortable with the idea of distance education and all the technological barriers, etc. But then 1 week later, we realized that we could not find a fast solution for that problem. So we decided to approach it from a different perspective. We started to consider, let's say, a longer term solution, knowing that the crisis would last for 5-6 months perhaps. And then we started considering solutions that would not only be solutions to the pandemic, because if we simply stopped for 4 months, we knew that we would have a much longer time. We would require a much longer time to recover everything that we lost. And my belief is that it will take us at least 2 years to go back to the original baseline scenario. And of course, technology may be the solution, but we have to be aware that there's a huge digital gap in Brazil. There's a big divide with a high number of students below poverty lines in our state network. So it's not enough to say just go online and take your classes online, because many students do not have access to technology. And according to our research, we realized that 98% of all households in Brazil have a mobile phone and also have a television set. So we know that most families therefore have a mobile phone, therefore they would have access to an app, and they would also have access to television. So our first action was to bring forward our vacations, our midterm vacations to April. And during that time, during that month when schools were closed, theoretically in vacation, we started putting together the system of how to include and how to embrace all this different variety of students. And we had to find solutions somehow quickly. And the whole team decided to work together because that was the only solution. We had to move forward, and we started meeting with our teachers every day. And that included over 70 live meetings with my teachers, 2-hour long meetings during that month. And we're talking about meetings with over 54,000 teachers, and they were connected all the time and sending back questions and sending suggestions. And there's an average about 15,000 students that join us every day about lunch, or joined us every day about around lunchtime, to tell us about problems they were facing with the app and everything. And of course, we always kept looking forward and considering as for example, in the case of our media center that we put together very quickly, and I had a previous experience in the state of Amazonas when I was state secretary in Amazonas, and I also took part in a course related to that, and also when I acted at federal level, I also worked in the area of putting together a media center. So I knew, based on my experience, that that could be a good solution. And then based on that, we built on that to develop more sophisticated solutions. So we can broadcast our classes live, and any student in Brazil that has a pay-as-you-go phone, uh, they can actually watch their classes for free without actually paying for the data package. So the education package is not removed from their data. And we also have 2 television channels that broadcast these classes for about 2 hours every day. We already know at the moment that some of these solutions will be permanent. The media center, for example, will stay even after the pandemic, and not as a replacement for face-to-face classes, but as a support measure for the students who need more support. We're also considering a program to provide equipment to those that are most vulnerable and that are more needy, and also as a remedial system to support those students that are more in need. And this is something that we have to address in Brazil. And another significant problem in Brazil is the very high dropout rates that we have in our schools, and as a result of the economic situation, as a result of unemployment, etc. So we have to find ways to support these families. And one solution for that is to provide scholarships to keep students at school. And the media center that we developed during the pandemic will be a key aspect of this support, because in every 4 students, one of them will receive support. And if all these 4 students are successful, they will also, as they reach their goals, they'll also have access to a free internet. This will be sort of an award for students that perform well. And that internet is not linked to education. They'll be able to use that internet package that they received as an award for anything that they want, for their games, for meeting their friends. So that's a kind of encouragement that we're going to provide to students. But this works in the team. So we team students in groups of 4, and then they have to work together, and all 4 of them need to achieve their goals. But for the moment, we're still providing distance education, developing materials, considering all the inequalities that we have in our state, all the challenges that we need to meet, and we must not leave anyone behind. I'm sorry if I spoke longer than I should, Fernando, I was just trying to provide a summary of the situation, but also emphasize the point that we're looking forward. Whatever we built during the pandemic has to be used, or we want it to be used to support our future. And we need to continue providing support all the way through 2022. And we are going to actually also provide an additional, a fourth year of education for secondary education. And we're going to provide that as an option for students. So if a student ends his secondary education, or his or her secondary education, and realizes that they still haven't reached the level that they would like to before going into the job market or going to university, they have the option, they will have the option of staying at school for a year longer so that they can improve the overall knowledge, so that they can prepare for university. So we have these two realities. So some students, they will realize that perhaps when they were at school, they did not have the kind of education that they wanted. And therefore, this is an opportunity for students who may feel left behind. And this, I think, is a good solution using both technology, but also face-to-face education, because technology has been really important, but it will never replace face-to-face education. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, thank you. It was a great summary, and in particular, this long-term view that you have.
Because it seems to me that you are a unique discussant of this case. I remember that in your dissertation, you were very interested, you examined the question of decentralization and governance and what that did to innovation. And this theme of innovation has remained in your career and has evolved into thinking about technology. And it seems to me that this case is a convergence of both of those things, how this situation creates an opportunity to use technology. But I'd like to hear you reflect on this case. What do you think are lessons that have larger consequence for other systems? And in particular, reflect on how the leadership, the management approaches have impacted the kind of innovation that is so evident in this case. Over to you.
Thank you, Fernando. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very proud of what a Brazilian state, São Paulo, the example that has set for other countries in the world. What I was most impressed in this case was that how fast and comprehensive the response to school closure was. And the idea of, for example, the idea of doing it gradually, for example, the first week, and prepare teachers and students and families for complete closure, I think was very important for the psychological well-being of the school education community. And also the awareness that the first impact that families would have of school closure, especially low-income families, would be to attend very basic needs like food. Now, many children depended on school meals for having their meals during the day. And the ability to do this cash transfer program directly to families in such a short period of time, I think is remarkable, knowing all the bureaucracies and how difficult it is to do cash transfers directly to the population in the public sector. And that had a very important psychological effect, that for families and students say, we are going to be taken care of. Someone is looking for us and understanding the challenges that this school closure would have on us. Third was the realization that only one strategy would reach most of the students, that it would be necessary to have an open and more democratic way of transmitting and delivering education, such as Open TV, apps, the data sponsor app that was developed for the Secretary of Education of São Paulo. So actually the negotiation that was done by São Paulo set a good example for other states that were trying to negotiate data sponsored apps for students, and we're facing many difficulties with the internet providers in Brazil. So the fact that São Paulo was able to do this negotiation opened an opportunity for other states. And of course, I have to highlight the ability to establish these partnerships with civil society organizations, which provided the funds and also the processes needed for putting these strategies in a very short period of time. We know, all of us that have been in the public sector, how things can move slow and how difficult it is to get immediate response for any work. So I think that these civil society organizations, foundations, and companies in Brazil help the Secretaria de Educação de São Paulo to move forward rapidly and to be able to implement, not only to plan, but to implement the solutions in a very fast mode. And I would like also to highlight the ability of Rossieli to be a true leader for other secretaries of education, sharing not only the achievements, but the problems that he was encountering to implement these activities and how he was looking for solutions, different solutions. I am a witness of the challenges that all secretaries of education faced in Brazil, and how important it was to be able to call Rossieli and ask, how did you do that? And can we do the same thing? And what are the problems? What you advise us? So this leadership role, I think it was very important. And the idea that this was not only as a response to the school closure. This would accelerate the innovations that we wanted for a long time in education to complement and to widen the opportunities for learning for Brazilian students. Brazilian students, as you may know, spend only 4 hours at school and only 3 or 2.5 and 3 engaged in learning activities while they are in schools. So we knew before that we needed to widen this time and to provide full-time education for students, but we had several barriers to that, economic barriers. So now I think São Paulo is proving that it's possible to do that, to really make the time in school well used and well spent, and it's essential. We all know that teachers' mediation is essential for learning, but also to add other online experiences that could help to provide more educational opportunities for Brazilian students. So I think I was very impressed. Rossieli was, when he was Minister of Education, he was able to launch a national program. Brazil spent 20 years without having a policy on educational technology. And in 2017, when Rossieli was in the Ministry of Education, he was able to launch a very interesting program, which we helped them to design. And I think his leadership, as I said, is going to be a landmark for Brazilian education, because innovations that we were trying to convince other secretaries of education of doing, now we have a concrete, a tangible example that it's possible and it can be done.
Lucia, thank you so very much. Patricia, you have been Secretary of Education of a state a lot smaller than the state of Sao Paulo, but you were able to advance a significant innovation agenda. So you're aware of what it takes to build trust, to build coalitions to make that possible. And then in your role as one of the leaders of the National Institute of Evaluation in Mexico at a time of a most ambitious reform, you're also aware of the many obstacles and difficulties of doing the same things at scale. And so as you think about what Brazil did, what strikes you as unique? What lessons do you think a country like Mexico could learn from this case?
Yes, thanks very much. Thank you very much, Fernando. Good morning to everyone. It was such a pleasure to read the study case. I think the first thing that I have to do is to acknowledge Secretary Rossieli for the efforts, the leadership, and the rapid answers to the students and to the community, to the educational community. I would just, as I was just reading the case, and I just want to say that something that for me was pretty interesting was the way in which they built partnerships with, like, to just move forward the plan that they had already organized or that they were thinking. I think that for Mexico, even if from my case, Puebla has obviously, as you said, like a smaller size of students but bigger size of schools. I was leading 15,000 schools then. I would just think that the partnerships, like build partnerships in so a fast and effective way, it's something that we have to learn from Sao Paulo. I think that I was just at the very beginning of the conversation, I was sharing with Lucia that I lived earthquakes, I lived national disasters, but never thought about a pandemic that has, I mean, not even an antecedent or in that perspective. So the pandemic certainly moved the leadership for each government pretty. I mean, it challenged too much. So just bringing them partnerships and social and civil society to the conversation and ask them for just join the effort in two precise perspectives. The first one is the one that Lucia already mentioned, is the nutritional and the delivery of how the cash transfers for the meals and for what is needed to keep on children with a healthy life, healthy style life. So I would just say, Fernando, from that point, that in Mexico, one concern about that is that we have to learn how fast Secretary Rossieli moved for the cash transfer. In the case of Mexico, like over the country, more than 6 million meals, daily meals, were released for more than 80,000 schools. So just if we multiply that number daily, it's like crazy, because we have been in lockdown for more than 4 months. The schools have been closed for more than 4 months now. So there's a huge amount of students without a meal that used to be delivered before the pandemic. So for that, we still have like this big question to the government, saying what has happened to that resources and what has happened to that economic transfer, and what has happened to that delivery of meals. I mean, we don't know anything about that, and that for sure is going to be a topic after we go back into schools. And the second one is in Mexico. I would say that's something that is also pretty replicable, but we didn't do that. Is that mostly 75% of the households have cell phones. So although we try to organize some kind of agreements with the ICT companies, we didn't get that. So the students can have access to the apps or to the content, to the online content that the government was releasing over the country. So I think those two things, Fernando, from our side, is something that you might think it will be very complicated to achieve, but the example of Sao Paulo is it is achievable. I mean, if you think about in a more holistic approach on having the students at home and not pretty able to have good access to healthy food, and that's something that the government has offered for so many years. And on the other way, the access to the online platforms or to the TV channels and whatever, those two topics were and are still in the agenda in Mexico. So I think that for me was pretty impressive to find how Secretary Rossieli just moved forward and just accompany not only the educational community, but also the houses and the needs from the parents and obviously the needs of a whole society. I don't feel yet, Fernando, that in Mexico there was a social concern about education, the education problem about like result of the pandemic. I think that, I mean, we face that we have to make up decisions, close the schools, let them go to vacations, plan what will be to go online, or like just charge and build and whatever platform that that was already there. And I think that for a good thing about Mexico, we have this institute that already delivers online content. But I think that from another perspective, we missed this feeling of being more careful about the needs of the families related to nutrition and social needs, and also to access to technologies. I would just say that, and that from that we have to learn from that, and the best example is that it is replicable.
Patricia, thank you so much for those comments. Andreas, You have, from the OECD, been doing something absolutely analogous to what Rossieli did from his role, which was you were able to pivot the entire organization, building all kinds of partnerships with organizations to very quickly be helpful to governments and others around the world in this pandemic. And in that role, you have been at the table in conversations all over the world as governments seek to respond. So you truly have a comparative framework to analyze what's unique about this case. What do you think are the most salient lessons for those who are listening to us and who will listen to the recording from these examples?
Well, thank you, Fernando, and my congratulations, Secretary Rossieli, for your amazing leadership in this crisis. And actually, I'm so happy to see you well again. And indeed, Fernando, I think there are so many parallels in the way Rossieli has handled this crisis and what we have seen in other places. First, you have reacted very quickly and very proactively. You had a plan and you were able to build the trust in your plan by families, by your educators. I think that's crucially important. If you lose that initial momentum, it's very, very hard to recapture, and you were really quick in the place and actually get it done. Second, I was very impressed. You have approached the challenges with a very holistic approach, not just substituting learning opportunities, which many countries have done, but you were also really focusing on welfare and nutrition. You picked the students up in their difficulties, whatever they were. I think that's very, very important and a key element to success. And we find in other places as well, sort of looking at, the whole range of outcomes and conditions in which students, study and teachers educate. Third, I think you have recognized very quickly that the reach of online learning is not up to the hype around it, that it was actually limited in reach, not just in São Paulo, but everywhere. And you have put together very comprehensive resource kits. You didn't start to sort of push everybody into an online solution, but you thought, what's available for who? It's television, it's, printed material, it's online resources. And I think that's a very powerful approach, that you actually started out from the needs of local kind of environments and then developed the solutions that reach them, even if they were not perfect. Obviously, online learning is more powerful than print, but you were not, falling into the trap of, compromising availability. Fourth, I think you left no one behind, and to do that, and I think that's actually a lesson that I've not seen anywhere else. You got your leaders and your teachers to take responsibility to follow up with every individual student. And I think that's a very, very powerful way to actually not just send a message to the students to get them on board, but also to send a message to the teachers that actually this is about inclusion. And I really think that's a remarkable, the other parts, I've seen in other places, but this is I think a special effort that you made. Fifth, and I think that's very important as well, you were willing to acknowledge difficulties. I think they're very, very apparent in this, and you were able to get people around you to address those difficulties, to share your vision and to take ownership for the challenges. These are the situations where even the best minister cannot solve the problem of, 10,000s of teachers and 100,000s of schools, where you actually need to, get the best ideas at the front line and mobilize and share them. And I think that's something very important. Sixth, and I think that's everywhere, you have established not just a shared vision, but you have given everyone a voice in that. And that's also been my experience, when we started to work on Visa for Schools with you. I remember our first conversation, normally state leaders say, okay, give me some data set on learning outcomes in my state or my country. And you said, no, I don't want this. I want something that is meaningful for every school. So for you, you have adopted the kind of PISA for School approach rather than a system-wide assessment. I think that's sort of giving everybody a voice in this process and making people part of the solution. I think is very, very important. Seventh, I think I'm at 7.7. You were sort of quick in upgrading the infrastructure. As you very well acknowledged, your media center was clearly not up to the task when the crisis started, but you stretched them. You basically said, look, this is the infrastructure that we have. This is the challenge that we need to address. here are the resources to grow to that challenge, to rise to that challenge. So I think really, mobilizing existing infrastructure, even if it was not fit for purpose, and I think that's a situation that many countries are finding, but many countries are not addressing well. Sort of, they rely on some kind of infrastructure, and then it doesn't work out. And I think you have really said, this is the center that we have. We're going to grow it, and we're able to do this. Another point I think that strikes me really is you were able to deploy what you learned in the Amazonas in a totally different context. I think that's an ability that's actually quite rare among leaders. People have the one solution, and if it doesn't work, they develop a new solution. And I think you were really able to mobilize the ideas, what can work in what context, and actually learn from that. And I think that allowed you to react very quickly. And last but not least, what impresses me also so much is how you remain connected with everyone. Someone who connects with 120,000 people on a regular basis. I think that's a very impressive. And this is sort of the only question I really have for you. What do you think was the reason that this didn't happen before? In a way, isn't that something that we should do on a regular basis to really build that kind of social fabric, that collaborative culture throughout the system? You have established this through the crisis, but what prevents us to do that in normal times? I leave it here.
Thank you very much, Andreas. This is wonderful. Rossieli, you have heard some reactions to what you're doing. There are lots of questions. I'm going to, in a moment, turn it over to you and ask you to respond to some of what you hear. But I wanted to begin with two questions myself, because it seems to me that as a leader, I'm interested in the question of what is it that leaders can do to unleash innovation. And I have just posted one of these reports that the OECD and others have done on how to seize the current moment to unleash innovation. It's in the chat room. And I think in your career, what I observe is that you have always valued a community that exposes you to a diversity of ideas. When I first met you in that program at Juice Fora, that was the whole principle of the program. Let's bring a group of diverse people together, give them the opportunity to learn from one another, expose them to people from other countries. And that is, I don't always find that with leaders. There are some leaders who are very inward looking, who only think that they can learn from those who are like them, who speak their language, are in their system. And you're different. When you and others came to Harvard and we arranged for you a program to look at innovation elsewhere, I saw that thirst. I saw that value in saying, I can learn from others, even if the systems are different. And the second thing that is very clear is that your leadership reflects an understanding of leadership as a distributed enterprise. Andreas was talking about that, bringing others along. Certainly, I see that in the community that was forming that leadership program throughout Brazil. I see that in this terrific innovation, the National Council of Education in Brazil that brings together the secretaries of education. But I also see that very much in how you're leading in Brazil as a distributed enterprise. So maybe if you could address the question of what would it take to get more leaders to conceptualize this moment as a moment to lead differently, as a way to bring the system forward and not backwards, which is a risk, right? It's very understandable that in the midst of what is going to be financial scarcity and constraints, in the midst of a situation that is an emergency, some people will retreat to forms of leadership that are more, shall we say, primitive, top down, I don't need a lot of dissent, I'm in charge, I'm the boss. This is not what you've done. So perhaps you could comment on that and on the other questions that others have posed for you. Over to you, Rossieli. You need to unmute your microphone, Rossieli.
Ok, thank you, professor. Bom, vamos lá. Muitas questões.
There are many questions. I think a very important thing for us to consider talking about leadership is that my team, I have many leaders in my team. I do not have a team that only react to something that I decide. I think this is really important, to have leaders around you. So everyone that works with me in all different areas, they are bold, They think outside the box. They leave their comfort zone, depending on the situation. And I'm not talking about the pandemic only. The whole situation of education in Brazil pushes us forward to improve. So I had the opportunity of doing something different in Amazon, sorry, in Amazonas, in the state of Amazonas, and also at the Ministry of Education. We had to face some challenges. I mean, at the time when I was in Amazonas, that was the state or the region that grew the most according to PISA, and this was because we had a number of leaders working with us, and that's how we should approach our team. Of course, important decisions must be taken, it must be assigned by the right people and with the right people. And the key decision here is that we have to do something. We will face obstacles, and of course, we still face these obstacles, but putting together this team and encouraging this team to take risks. This is important. We need more leaders in the area of education. This is key. Another important thing that was very clear to us right at the beginning, I'll just sort of mix some of the questions that I read here. So I'll just answer them all together, sort of. So, but we knew at the time that we were going to face an economic crisis. And of course, I wouldn't have the funds or the money that I needed to do everything. So engaging, working together with civil society was very important during this process. But it was very important to be clear, to tell civil society exactly what we needed, where we needed support. So the clearer we are, when we recognize our shortcomings and our difficulties, usually the response is a lot better. And Lucia Dellagnello can attest to that. We've known each other and we've worked together for a long time. But she can also confirm that this whole process becomes more assertive when we are clear about our needs. And just for you to have an idea, we only used public funds for the media center to pay for the internet through a very important negotiation process, and TV Cultura, which is this public TV channel, which enables us to broadcast live lessons from anywhere. Basically, at the moment, any teacher can use that app from anywhere. And somebody asked in the chat, okay, if a teacher has a comorbidity, how are they going to engage? They have to go to a specific place to broadcast the lessons? And the answer is no, they can do it from anywhere. Now, when we started back then, according to studies, if we if we interrupt education for a long period of time, this will lead to significant problems. You know, even if students are at home, they are not really protected because there's a lot of inequalities in the situation. Some children live in slums and they do not have the necessary space that they will need for their development. So our focus was on what was possible, the kind of learning that would be possible in this first period, selecting and prioritizing what was most important and fundamental for us to move forward. Secondly, there's another dimension that's also important. And building on the question about school meals. So we effectively stopped and suspended all classes on the 23rd of March. And on the 7th of April, 2 weeks later, we started providing these grants to support vulnerable families, and so that they could buy food for their children who were our students. So currently 750,000 students in our network who were linked to some social programs, they started receiving these grants. And then we expanded actually our reach, and whoever approaches us and tells us that they are in need, then we can provide support together with the private sector. And those families that are most vulnerable, they receive some funds from us and additional support from the private sector. And we also worked together with one company, one enterprise that provides online wires or through this partnership that we developed with one of these apps, we were able to transfer those funds at no costs. So they were able to use those electronic types of payment at no cost, because we understand that for some people, even paying a small fee might have a huge impact. So this was actually all very it happened very fast. So that was the first version. The first step that we took was to have a studio operating so that we could start as soon as possible resuming our classes. So we also realized from the beginning that interactivity was fundamental, so we never gave up on that. And we started working together with our teachers to help them understand that this whole process was important. Now, the other question was about mobilization. So we started showing everything that we could do. With high level of execution, a very decentralized approach, because of course it wouldn't be possible for me to centralize all the decisions and all the actions. So we focused on decentralization, but also making sure that things happened. And then, of course, at this point, when we prove that the project can work, then the private sector will buy the idea and start working with me. So we have not spent a single penny to produce content. We received lots of support and lots of content from our partners. Lucia has been very helpful in that regard as well. And of course, leadership plays a very important role in the sense of encouraging people to participate. And I think there's a question about this here too, and Fernando made it very clear. It's not possible for us to do everything on our own. The government cannot do everything alone within the short period of time that we have available. So we're talking about extreme conditions, and and we still need support. So sometimes, perhaps at the beginning, we needed to buy sanitizer and buy some other protection items. Of course, we would spend public funds for that. But there's so many things that we can spend our money on. And of course, we rely on support from the private sector and from our partners. And I think what's most important now is how to mobilize that in following up students' learning. We are monitoring the work of all our students. 75% of our students have their own scores already, their own notes on how things are progressing. And we also have devised systems to provide remedial support to the students as we move forward, both face-to-face and online. I don't know if I were able to address all the points or summarize all the answers, because there are many questions. We are aware that we have a number of challenges, and we have not reached all our audience yet, but we are trying to expand our actions as much as possible. And I'm every day impressed by the role and the leadership of our teachers. Some teachers, they leave their homes and they go to the students' homes to provide them guidance. Sometimes they have to drive 100 kilometers and they go there face to face during a pandemic just to check if the students are doing fine. And if they realize that the students, for example, do not have food at home, then the teachers are there voluntarily teaching them what they can do to achieve or to get what they need and all the support that's available. And it's amazing what our teachers are doing. They're all aware of the situation. And just to end, I'd like to add one final point. Something that was seen as an obstacle for our teachers. Many were afraid of technology and they thought, well, technology is going to replace me as a teacher. And I think what we have learned during this crisis, perhaps this is the biggest learning that the whole education sector has had during this whole time, is the fact that, we can all learn from that. Technology is not our enemy. Using innovation and technology is not working against us. Actually, we are able in a way to speak the language of our students and follow up on their learning. So even despite all the technology that we have, we're not replacing people. Our media center is not replacing our teachers. We started from our own studio, but now all our teachers, our hundreds of thousands of teachers, they can actually broadcast their classes from their own homes. So the key aspect, the key element are our people, our teachers. Of course, we need to improve. There's a lot of room for improvement, but the central, the critical aspects of this whole process, of this whole endeavor, are our people. In this process of leadership development, Professor, I think this has become very clear for us here in São Paulo and in the whole of Brazil. We won't be able to achieve anything unless we mobilize people engaged in change. Whether we're talking about civil society, our civil servants and teachers, and our team who are working with our students, especially those students that are facing more difficulties. So our whole system is based on people. Now, there's a number of questions coming here, and I am available here. If we're not able to answer all the questions here now, I'm ready and willing to answer them later.
Ask you questions in your Twitter, you will take the time to answer. I'm going to ask now my colleagues on the panel to just make a minute of closing remarks, having heard you speak. But I want to highlight one of the things that I've just heard you address in this presentation and that I'm aware of, which is how you have managed to build an ecosystem by connecting various institutions. I know you're working very closely with universities. For our audience, Brazil, in the very many years it neglected its primary and secondary schools, it did not neglect its universities. And certainly your national public universities and your state universities are unparalleled in their levels of excellence and capacity. Some of the very best universities in the world rankings are Brazilian universities. And I find it very interesting how you have managed to build a continuum of innovation by engaging universities in helping you. This is not something that I see every education system do. For many, these are silos that are totally disconnected. So let me now turn it over to Andreas for some closing remarks in response to what you've heard, then Patty, and then Lucia.
Well, thanks. I mean, your responses to the questions were as inspiring as your talk early on. And I think what struck me in your responses actually very much is that you keep your eyes at a horizon that goes well beyond the immediate crisis. You have a vision for an education system, and every investment that you make, every relationship that you build, every company that you come on board is making a contribution to that future education systems, not just, filling the gaps in the crisis. I think that's very important. And I really think, you could see a different education system for Sao Paulo and maybe for Brazil coming up. You see technology as a tool to amplify the work of great teachers, not as a tool to an innovation replace teachers. And I think, again, a people-centered approach that is built around the diversity of student needs, that actually is a system where not only students learn, but teachers learn and school leaders learn, and you as secretary learning every day. I think that's very much, the future of education.
I would like to make I'm sorry, Patty, it's you.
No, go ahead. Don't worry, Rosia. Just follow the path. I just add to what Andreas just said, that I think that we still have to, from your experience, Secretary Rossieli, we have to still on fighting, if it's a proper word, that to keep on empowering the local agendas and the local secretaries and the local ministries of education. I think that from the perspective of Mexico, which is a very centralized content country, but very decentralized country regarding decision making, I think that we have a pathway there to fulfill. And I think that we have to take your experience from that. Another takeaway for me, and I think that's also a takeaway for the audience, should be the sense of confidence. I think that you have been very practical, but at the same time very sure about what the messages should be and what the community has to hear from you. So I think I'm more convinced after hearing your case and your experience at what you have done, that empowering the local governments, the sense of confidence, and I will be more than happy to follow up the steps about what will be your out-of-the-box strategy for that teacher professional development strategy. Thanks very much.
I would like to make a very similar point to Andreas, that I think I'm very curious and I will be there helping to make this case of São Paulo really a legacy to Brazilian education. We at CIEB, we have been working for many years trying to make this point clear, that technology can help us to improve the quality and equity of Brazilian education. But until now, it seemed like a distant dream. So I'm very interested in now in analyzing what kind of innovations were unleashed and incorporated in educational systems all over Brazil, and I think in Latin America. I think if this pandemic left one legacy, and that is the transformation in innovation in education, we are going to have a positive outcome of these very difficult times that we are all living in. So I hope that education will never be the same. We are not going to be back to normal, as a lot of people say. I think we are going to be back to a new education that tries and incorporates all innovations to make sure that all students learn. Thank you.
Lucia, thank you. And thank you, Rossieli, and thank you, Patricia and Andreas, for a very inspiring and hopeful conversation. In a tragic moment where 15 million people have been infected and 624,000 have lost their lives, where there is no way to deny the severity of the disruptions that this is causing and is going to cause, you have reminded us that each and every one of us has a role to play in making sure that the consequence of this pandemic is not a world that is more complicated than the world that as it was before the pandemic, but that we actually take concrete steps towards a renaissance. Rossieli, you're clearly doing that in Brazil. Thank you to all who have joined us in an expression of hope that we can actually build that world. So thank you, you inspire us. We look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you.